The last chapter in AMP1 is the autonomic nervous system. Although it's the last chapter, in my view, it's the very most important chapter we will have done in AMP1. Not just for your preparation for AMP2, but even going forward in the field of medicine. A lot of medications target the autonomic nervous system. So when you move on to a pharmacology course or you're learning about medications, it's very important to have a strong foundation in the autonomic nervous system. And this is the nervous system that controls all those organs you're going to learn about in AMP2. The autonomic nervous system controls a lot of your cardiovascular system. It controls your digestive system and respiratory system and urinary system and reproductive systems. So it's super important. It's not a long chapter, but it's going to have a lot of really helpful information going forward. So we're going to compare the autonomic nervous system to the somatic nervous system and kind of review the organization of the nervous system as a whole. Take a look at the differences and similarities between somatic versus autonomic. If you recall, the somatic nervous system controls skeletal muscles voluntarily, whereas the autonomic nervous system has involuntary control over basically everything else. We divide the autonomic nervous system into two subdivisions, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Most of our organs are controlled by both subdivisions, but they're going to do different things to those organs. And it largely depends on understanding that your body has two kind of situations. It can be in a resting situation, which is dominant. You're mostly in a resting state. But then it can switch to a fight or flight state. So fight or flight is sympathetic. It has to do with increasing energy during emergency situations or during exercise where you need an increase in energy during that activity. We're going to look at the neurotransmitters that are used and the receptors that are required to detect those neurotransmitters. The very end of the chapter goes over select actions of the autonomic nervous system. What that means is we're going to take a look at different organs and see what the sympathetic division does to that organ during times of emergency or energy or exercise situations, and then what might the parasympathetic division do to that organ during rest. And a lot of these organs are going to be organs you learn about in AMP2, so it's a nice introduction to some of these internal organs. So let's look at this diagram. We've looked at this in the past. This is just giving us an overview of the organization of the nervous system with the CNS, brain and spinal cord, input coming from sensory neurons or the sensory division of the PNS. And then over here is the motor division. And that's where we're going to focus on this motor division. Here's the somatic nervous system. The effectors, or the organs that it controls, are skeletal muscle. So the somatic motor neurons stimulate skeletal muscle contraction. Everything else is autonomic. So we're going to be looking at the heart, organs that have smooth muscle, for example, the respiratory tract, GI tract, urinary tract, reproductive tracts. Blood vessels have smooth muscle. Also going to be looking at glands and look at what glands are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And the heart's the easy one because we kind of know what our heart does during rest compared to during exercise or a fight or flight situation. So that's where we're going to be focused. The autonomic nervous system using sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions to control many of the organs in the human body. This is just another kind of overview of the two systems, skeletal muscle control versus everything else. When we look at the autonomic nervous system, it's very important to understand what we mean by sympathetic divisions or actions or situations versus parasympathetic. So we often refer to sympathetic as fight or flight responses. So that's typically in an emergency situation, right? What are you going to need to fight that situation or get away from it? You're going to need a lot of energy. So a lot of what we understand is going to require you to just think about where energy comes from. What do we use for energy? We often call these E situations. So the E stands for energy. So situations that require you to have energy. Emergency situations. Exercise. So exercising, your body is in a sympathetic state. Embarrassment, excitement. Those are all E situations. Parasympathetic, we typically think of rest and digest. So what are we going to do when the body is resting? Typically, we're going to increase our digestive system. We're going to increase our urinary system because those two systems aren't necessarily useful during fight or flight. This is a table. It's kind of a better table to use as a summary at the end, but we're going to use it to kind of introduce some of the details that we're going to be looking at. But you might want to refer back to this as a review table. So this column is somatic nervous system, skeletal muscle control, right? Typically conscious and voluntary, but there are some unconscious movements of skeletal muscle. Stimulates contraction, obviously. The motor neurons extend from the CNS directly to the skeletal muscle. So we call that a one neuron arrangement. All right. Whereas when we get to autonomic, we're going to look at the two neuron arrangement. The neurons are myelinated. That allows you to have very quick skeletal muscle contractions. The neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And then the receptors on the skeletal muscle are classified as nicotinic receptors. We're going to classify receptors later in this PowerPoint, but acetylcholine receptors are divided into either nicotinic receptors or muscarinic receptors. Okay, so let's look at the autonomic. We know it controls basically everything else: smooth muscle, cardiac, and glands. Involuntary or unconscious regulation. All right. There is a little bit of conscious mental influence, but largely this system is automatic or involuntary. Targets are either stimulated or inhibited. It kind of depends on the situation. So for example, if we're looking at the stomach, it's going to be stimulated by parasympathetic nervous system, but it's going to be inhibited by sympathetic. All right. So we have to look at each organ individually. The neuron arrangement. So when the signal comes out of the CNS, it requires two neurons to get to the target. They're going to connect at what's called an autonomic ganglion. So that's where the first neuron will stimulate the second neuron. That first neuron, because it's before the ganglion, is known as preganglionic. And if you're after the ganglion, you're known as postganglionic. So the postganglionic neuron is the one that's going to be directly controlling the target organ. And we'll take a look at this using some better imagery. Myelination, so the preganglionic neurons happen to be myelinated, the postganglionics are unmyelinated. And then the neurotransmitters are slightly different. Preganglionic neurons are always going to be using acetylcholine. Doesn't matter if it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. Postganglionic is where it differs. If you are parasympathetic, you use acetylcholine. If you are sympathetic, 99 times out of 100, you're using norepinephrine. There's always a few exceptions. And then the receptors, again, it depends on the organ. If it's an acetylcholine receptor, it's either nicotinic or muscarinic. If it's a receptor for epinephrine and norepinephrine, it's known as adrenergic. And those come in different types, alphas and betas. So again, that's a lot of information and not very visual in the table. So you might want to refer back to it. So let's start with this comparison of these motor neurons. So we're going to look at the effectors. We already did, but notice this top panel is the somatic nervous system, which is controlling skeletal muscle. This middle panel is sympathetic, and the bottom panel is parasympathetic. And notice here the autonomic divisions are controlling heart, glands, and this is a bladder, which represents smooth muscle. So the effectors are different. Number of motor neurons. Notice the somatic motor neuron is starting in the CNS, in this case the spinal cord. It comes out the ventral root and extends all the way to the muscle. So it's a one motor neuron arrangement. In the sympathetic panel here, we're using two. The first one comes out of the CNS, uses that same ventral root, synapses with another neuron inside the ganglion. So there's the autonomic ganglion, where we have the preganglionic neuron releasing acetylcholine that stimulates the postganglionic neuron, which then is releasing norepinephrine. So that's a two neuron arrangement. And notice the parasympathetic down here is also using two neuron arrangement. So what's the autonomic ganglion? That's where the pre and post ganglionic neurons communicate with one another. Again, pre releases the neurotransmitter. Post ganglionic requires a receptor for that neurotransmitter. Myelinated versus unmyelinated. Somatic motor neurons are myelinated, and all of these pre-ganglionic neurons are myelinated. Post-ganglionic are unmyelinated. Neurotransmitters. So you'll notice you got a lot of ACH, a lot of acetylcholine. Somatic uses acetylcholine. Preganglionic releases acetylcholine. Preganglionic releases acetylcholine. The one that uses norepinephrine is right here. The sympathetic postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine instead of acetylcholine. Usually. We're going to learn one example that's different. That's if it's a sweat gland, it's going to release acetylcholine. All right, so that way, think about it. These organs know that if they get stimulated by norepinephrine, they need to do one thing, like maybe raise the heart rate. Whereas if they're getting stimulated by acetylcholine, they have to do something different, such as lower the heart rate. So organs are what we call dual innervated, where a sympathetic neuron is going to be doing one thing and a parasympathetic neuron is going to be doing something different. One other thing we want to notice here is when we study the sympathetic division, it's going to activate a gland. It's going to stimulate the adrenal gland. This is an adrenal gland. It sits on top of your kidneys. And the center region of the adrenal gland is known as the adrenal medulla. That part of the adrenal gland has cells called chromaffin cells that can produce epinephrine and norepinephrine as hormones, and they will go into the bloodstream. So now when you have a fight or flight situation or exercising, you're not just stimulating these organs with norepinephrine from a sympathetic neuron, you're stimulating them using hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these are often called adrenaline and noradrenaline. Okay, so that's another kind of additional feature of the sympathetic division in that it causes the production of epinephrine and norepinephrine as hormones. Couple terms to make sure you're aware of: cholinergic versus adrenergic. Cholinergic means acetylcholine. So we use that word to describe neurons that might release acetylcholine. So somatic motor neurons are cholinergic. The preganglionic neurons are cholinergic. The postganglionic Parasympathetic neurons are cholinergic. If you release norepinephrine, we call you adrenergic. So this neuron here is adrenergic. We also use those terms for the receptors. So if you're a receptor for acetylcholine, you're a cholinergic receptor. If you're a receptor for epinephrine and norepinephrine, you are an adrenergic receptor. So we're going to use those terms quite a bit. This is often a scary figure for most ANP1 students. It was scary for me the first time I saw it. But basically, I think of these as roadmaps for the two subdivisions. They're both starting in the CNS, right? And they're ending up going to all these organs. But how the signal gets there is different. So you'll notice in this side, this is the sympathetic division. Your sympathetic division, also called the thoracolumbar, comes out of the thoracic spinal cord and lumbar spinal cord. So that's where the nerves come out. Then they find their ganglia, right? There's a ganglion for the sympathetic division called the chain ganglion. That's this big chain here. So it might go through the chain, or it might go to these other ganglion. And that, again, is where it synapses with the postganglionics. And then those end up going to the organs, either respiratory tract, maybe we're going to the heart or liver or stomach, kidneys, or bladder. All right. Now, the parasympathetic division just uses a different roadmap, right? Just uses a slightly different way to get to the same organ. So I think of it as the difference between my wife and I, right? I might drive a certain way to get to a restaurant. Well, she has her way to get there. We're both going to get there. We just get there differently. And then what we do there is quite a bit different. I eat a ton of unhealthy food, and she eats nice and healthy food. But anyway, that's all this is doing. It's showing you the different roadmaps. Parasympathetic is known as craniosacral because it uses 4 cranial nerves, and then it uses nerves that come out of the sacral spinal cord called pelvic nerves. And those neurons get to the same basic places as the sympathetic division. One thing to note is, what are the 4 cranial nerves that carry parasympathetic neurons? We have cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, cranial nerve 7, facial, cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, and of course the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 7. Those are the 4. All right, so let's not panic when we look at this figure. Just think of it as different routes taken if you are sympathetic versus parasympathetic. I think we're going to use this slide as the beginning to the second video and last video. The next video is going to be where we're going to get into receptors, but also what are these organs doing. All right, so the next video is going to be the most important video. All right, so be prepared to kind of learn about neurotransmitters and receptors, but also get into all these organs that are controlled by your autonomic nervous system.